So as you can see from the title, it was a bit of a challenge to communicate to people what it is that we're looking at today and what we're focusing on. So I hope in this introduction and as the speakers that we have on the program today discuss their experiences, it will become more clear or evolve that this is not a day looking at big data. This is not a day for doing big quantitative analysis. Today is about looking at the individual people and the smaller communities who are very active and have very rich sort of histories and memories that are being documented online, who are worth capturing, and what the methods and approaches we can use both as archivists and information professionals to ensure that we're capturing those interactions online, as well as how we can empower people to do that for themselves and to understand the value of the content that they're creating. So welcome again. If you are a Twitterer, we do have a hashtag for the day, which you can just see on this first slide. It's also on the bottom of your program, so do feel free. It is a social media and web event, so we are happy for you to share that with the wider world. So on the program today, after I stop speaking, you'll hear from a number of different people who are working both with community and individual archives in other digital formats to give a bit of a background about how digital assets, digital personal collections have already begun to appear in archives and what those challenges are, as opposed to big institutional archives or big data. And then we'll hear about some case studies specifically about social media and how social media is being integrated into wider web collections to represent different groups or different events or different places or people. And then after the lunch break, we have a little bit more of a practical session. So it is a workshop, so I do hope you will engage with the different tools and approaches that we'll discuss. But just to say, we've chosen specific tools and methods, some of which are very quick and dirty. You can do it sitting right here at this table, download it and go. And then a couple of slightly more complex tools that might take you more like an afternoon to sit down and get your head around. But the aim is to share methods that are easy to approach, whether you have a technical background or not, that are easy to teach others, to teach creators, people who might be depositing content in your archive or groups that you want to be able to empower to archive themselves. And at the end of the day, for our next technical trick, we are going to have two of the creators of Social Feed Manager beamed in all the way from Washington, D.C. to talk about how they have developed Social Feed Manager to collect social media as part of archive and library collections and to support researchers. So basically today is about learning how and why you would go about collecting the individual web and social media creations of different individuals, different communities, so that we have these representative voices in the archives that are recorded to help give a richer, fuller picture of who is actually participating sort of in our social lives. So with that, I hand you over to Sharon Webb.
Okay, good morning. I'm Sharon Webb. I'm a lecturer in the University of Sussex. I'm also a member of the Sussex Humanities Lab and I lecture in Digital Humanities. I do traditional history as well. I do British and Irish history. I do associational culture and social networks. I also do a lot of work around digital archiving, digital preservation and looking at the use of technology for historical inquiry. So, for example, how we might use computational methods for historical sources. I suppose my background is history and computer science, and before I moved to the University of Sussex, I worked for the Digital Repository of Ireland. I was the requirements manager there, so worked closely with the software development team to develop the specifications for the Trusted Digital Repository. Worked with the policy manager as well for various policy developments for the Trusted Digital Repository, and was on various task force included copyright and metadata. But today, I suppose I'm here to talk to you about a British Academy project that I'm running. It's called Identity, Representation and Preservation in Community Digital Archives and Collections. And this project in many ways makes an intervention in three important areas. The first is community archives, their practice and their preservation, digital preservation, and content representation as well. So community archives, digital preservation, content representation. But I suppose more broadly, or perhaps significantly, it's also an attempt to bridge the gap between community archives and the digital preservation community. So to make sure that there's a dialogue in terms of maybe resource sharing and also providing infrastructural advice and support. Just to give you a quick overview of the Sussex Humanities Lab, if you haven't heard of us, we're a research programme. We're tasked with embedding digital humanities across the university within research and teaching. We're a multidisciplinary team. We're located and embedded in different schools, but we work collaboratively together. We lobby and advocate on behalf of the lab from within our departments and can initiate and develop digital humanities and/or digital history programmes as part of a wider programme of development. So we're kind of beyond the schools that we're situated in. And so this British Academy grant that I'll talk to you about stems from my background with Digital Repository of Ireland and also from the research that I've been doing with the Sussex Humanities Lab. And it's also, I suppose, from my engagement with LGBTQ plus communities in Brighton. And when I moved to Brighton, learning about the various community projects that were developed over the last number of decades, which have played an important role not only in curating and saving LGBTQ plus cultural heritage, but also advocating, challenging and working with the GLAM sector on these issues in Brighton and Hove and kind of more broadly in Sussex. And one of the projects that has come up in these conversations was a community archive called Brighten Our Story. I don't know if anyone here has heard of this. But as a community archive, Brighten Our Story ran for about 24 years, from 1989 to 2013. And over the course of the 24 years, amassed a large collection of ephemera, oral history interviews, publication, photographs, and they also held exhibitions and created various publications related to LGBTQ plus cultural heritage in Brighton. And the motivation, I suppose, for Brighten Our Story was prompted and motivated by what Tom Sargent, who was one of the co-founding members of Brighten Our Story, stated in an interview in the late 2000s, was the Conservative 1988 law known as Section 28, which banned the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and schools in the UK. So Brighten Our Story then was created both as an archive and in a way as a community hub. So a way to kind of bring a community that felt they were under attack together in a positive way. So Section 28 brought about, as Sargent describes, a great sense of a culture under attack and of a need to put down roots strongly. So this archival need was prompted by legislation that tried to attack LGBT communities, but these communities, however, reacted by creating positive alternative voices and narratives to those promoted and sanctioned by Thatcher's government. So this archival activism then is a key component of the strength and the need for grassroots archives, since they transmit positive counterpoints to dominant narratives. So they create representation, they create visibility, and they demand that society remembers. So in essence then, is this exercise right to be represented, to be visible, is a reaction to historical systems of memory, of archives and record keeping in the analogue world, which have in the past silenced or suppressed marginalised voices and communities from the historical record. So for example, state building apparatus, like national archives and museums, in the past have projected a particular narrative to solidify a perceived national identity. And as Andrew Flynn, who has written extensively on the topic, states, in reality, the mainstream or formal archive sector does not contain or represent the voices of the non-elites, the grassroots, the marginalised. So Brighton Our Story, like many community archives, was based on an inner community knowledge. It could gather authentic stories, authentic experiences, and the community was actively involved in the work of the archive, something that perhaps conventional archives can't really do in many respects or support. So it's for this reason, among other social, cultural, education, and of course legislative reasons, that I should ask that grassroots archives, DIY community archives have developed in various forms across various geographical boundaries, across multiple cultural, societal and political lines. And possibly some of you know of this initiative anyway, the Community Archives and Heritage Group. But this is a special interest group of the Archives and Records Association for UK and Ireland, and it has 500 officially registered community archives on the site, but in reality there's probably more in the thousands of these types of archives. But what this demonstrates then is community archives are omnipresent, they're widespread, and indeed they are required. In many cases, they provide alternative voices, alternative narratives, alternative historical records, which may not exist anywhere else. So they serve an important, they have an important role to play. So Brighton Our Story then is just one registered archive in this community group. And similar community archives listed here include the Cork LGBT Archive, the Plymouth LGBT Archive, the Feminist Web Archive Manchester, the Ruckus Black LGBT Archive in London, among many others. And a number of these are digital, or at least have a significant digital component. Community archives are, as you might expect, normally community driven, whether community is defined by the local area or by a political or cultural or even some culture affiliation, by heritage background, by gender politics, or indeed by sexual identity and politics. They are also normally community and in the majority of cases voluntary led. So Brighton Our Story was community led, driven and organised, and relied on volunteers, and it ran, as I said, until 2013. At that stage, it had a significant web presence, although it wouldn't be what you might technically call a digital archive. It was predominantly an analogue collection. But I used this case study to demonstrate the power of community archives and also their fragility and potential of loss. So after 24 years, the physical archive ceased to exist. Objects, documents either went back to original donors, some went to the Keep Archive, which is part of the University of Sussex and the East Sussex Records Office in Brighton. Some were destroyed, and some went back to, as I said, original donors, and some are still with the volunteers that led the community archive. But the legacy of Brighton Our Story and the community memory of this important collection persists. But since Brighton Our Story, a number of other projects and initiatives have taken place in Brighton, and one includes Queer in Brighton, which over the course of 2 years, from 2012 to 2014, carried out 60 to 70 oral history interviews. They also collected written testimonies as well. So they capture an important aspect of cultural heritage in Brighton, both from past and present members of the LGBTQ+ community. So Queer in Brighton also started collecting ephemera and have used their website to publish some of the oral history transcripts until there was a takedown request from one of the original contributors. So Queer in Brighton decided, actually, we'll just take everything down. So currently none of that content is available. But looking beyond Brighton, however, we know that communities, self-identified and self-acknowledged, which have been traditionally absent from the formal narratives presented in official archives, use digital platforms as a means to represent and reconstruct their narratives of significance. And while some archives, like the Cork LGBT Archive, have carried out an extensive programme of digitisation, many now also face a transition from collecting physical records, which may or not have been digitised, to collecting contemporary records in a digital-only or born digital form. And many don't even realise that this is the next significant problem that they face. Many community archives are now using Facebook as a means to collect objects, collect resources for the community and by the community. So the point is, these alternative representations created by community archives to ensure representation, to ensure visibility, are at risk of loss because of the fragility of the human infrastructures, that is the volunteers, and the digital ones that support them. So I don't know if possibly most people in the room have seen this, but the Digital Preservation Coalition's report last year, the bit list listed community archives and community generated digital content as a critically endangered digital species. And what that definition means as a blank slide is that digital materials are listed critically endangered where they face material technical challenges to preservation. There are no agencies responsible for them, or those agencies are unwilling or unable to meet preservation needs. So I think in terms of kind of the community archives that exist and that are using things like Facebook, Twitter, or even, you know, creating their own WordPress and whatever site that is, they're not really sure where to go for support for maintaining the long-term preservation of their sites. And some examples, and I use this just to demonstrate in terms of the work that I'm doing with the various archives that I'm working with. So the examples that the DPC provide of some of these critically endangered are data of marginalised or subculture groups, one-off projects in art, heritage, environment, digital and digitised oral histories, recordings of BME oral history. So you can see that they're, you know, exactly the content that I'm working with, and I'm, you know, the communities that I'm kind of engaged with at the moment. And as a DPC list as well. So the reasons for risk include lack of knowledge about the potential risks, lack of resources, lack of adequate funding, or no access to digital preservation infrastructures. So to highlight this, I applied for British Academy funding last year, and I'm now halfway through, or 3/4 of the way through, a 12-month research project that has tried to highlight the problem of long-term digital preservation in community archives. So I'm working closely with the Queer in Brighton project and the Brighton Digital Festival on issues that have arisen, especially around safeguarding these oral history testimonies. And at a workshop related to this project in June of this year, which Paul attended and spoke eloquently at, community archives managers gathered and spoke openly about their motivations and frustrations, their challenges and their opportunities. That they share their insights and their anxieties, and some cited similar problems as those identified by the DPC. I'll come back to this slide actually maybe in a few minutes, but that's just a kind of an outline of the projects or the events that I've been running for this British Academy grant. So speaking to these archive managers or volunteers, that they cited the burden of no or low budget or inadequate funding streams which have no plan for the aftercare of collections. So something like the Heritage Lottery Fund, where they have, and this was essentially the problem that Queer in Brighton found themselves in, that they had gotten a chunk of money to carry out the oral histories, to bring together volunteers to support those type of activities. But at the end of that project, they had no money to catalogue it, to put it anywhere, to store it securely. So essentially, it's a hard drive, which is now sitting in my office. They also stated lack of skills or adequate training, not knowing which was the right technology choice. So people who are running community archives had asked us in 2000, we didn't know whether or not we should choose Access as a database to use. And they were like, well, we're still using that. Should we use something else? Another person asked about WordPress. Is that safe to use for our current websites, or what might be the alternative? So just not knowing where to go with these questions was one of the big things that they cited. And also the challenge of keeping up with technology and implementing systems that last. So thinking about those things with little or no training or little or no support. Often people working in isolation on their own and trying to kind of maintain these systems. I think one of the biggest problems as well, which was mentioned in that session in June, was that one gatekeeper existed for some of these collections, one gatekeeper for the entire digital collection. And this was especially true of the Cork LGBT archive. Orla Egan was very open about the frustrations that she's had. So she was saying that she's the only one with the password for her digital archive, and that really instills fear and anxiety in her on a regular basis. And I also thought it was quite interesting. So Topher Campbell, who was talking about the Ruckus Archive, he mentioned a quote from William Blake, and his idea about kind of like the systems that community archives use or marginalised communities use, and kind of maybe pushing against that. He said, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. So thinking about kind of what we expect people to use or what we think they might be able to use and actually what their pushback is. I think that's quite important as well. I told Paul that I was going to mention them here. So Paul tweeted on that day, and as a digital preservation community, I think it's something that we know that, you know, technology is only a third of the problem in digital preservation. The other challenges are organisation and resourcing, and often these are the most challenging. And I think that was the biggest thing that came out in that 2-day event, was that, you know, the will is there, but often it's the organisational structures that aren't there. It's the resourcing that isn't there, and you know, it's the kind of the future planning that individuals might not know about. I mean, I think it's also another thing to remember as well, the use of language. So when we were talking about maybe digital preservation, trusted digital repositories, migration, and members of community archives were like, well, I don't know what that is, you know, and just not even knowing the question to ask, or, you know, to be able to do research around this. And then reliance on third-party services was one thing that came up as well. So some of you might have already seen this, but you know that third-party services like Flickr, like Twitter, like Facebook change their terms and conditions. They change their terms of use on a regular basis. So Flickr, over the last month, I think it was in November, they announced that they were changing their limits for free users. So there's many community archives that have used Flickr as a way to publish their photographs, their ephemera, and now face a challenge in terms of maybe, well, they might be deleted if it's not CC BY. So I think for me, the crucial thing here is there's a real danger that we are replicating systems of suppression, systematic forgetfulness within our digital environments. So while there is an autonomy and agency which gives community archives their power, in some cases, this characteristic may also be their major downfall, especially in terms of digital material and digital archives. So what, therefore, are the implications of a community-driven approach to long-term sustainability of these constructed and reconstructed narratives, and how might we support community archives with their endeavours without removing their agency? So working with Queer in Brighton, with the DPC, with Brighton Digital Festival, and with Sussex Humanities Lab, I hope to continue working on some of these solutions. But it's not an easy task, and I suppose the first task is highlighting this issue, stating the problem, and then working from there. We want to unlock the resources that we have access to share knowledge, to share skills, and in many ways to share the burden. So Adam is here from the University Library at Sussex, and you know, we're working, myself as a researcher, I'm working with Queer in Brighton and with the library, working to think about kind of, you know, a pilot project using Atom, supported by ITS, which Queer in Brighton will have ownership of. We're kind of really taking seriously this idea that it's the power of the community archives is their agency and their ability to be able to run that themselves. So we don't want to swoop in as an institution and go, we'll have all this stuff and we'll mind it. We want them to have control over that. So unlocking those resources, creating that conversation and creating that dialogue. I suppose this is to kind of finish off with just thinking about one of the last event that I had was around queer archiving, recommissioning the queer oral history, oral histories. And one of the things that kind of came out of that project where we were thinking about how we might make this available, I was getting members of the community to listen to these oral histories and to write metadata for it. So kind of developing skills within the community. So we were doing a very simple Dublin Core Google form where they could think about, you know, the fields that might be required. And what happened within that was actually quite a nice thing of, you know, ways of listening. So the importance of these collections. So I just used audio splitters, so people were listening together to these oral histories. So rather than just listening in isolation and writing metadata, there was a kind of a collective listening. And what that really brought to the fore was maybe unconscious bias in the way people were listening to these oral histories. And then ways of archiving as well. There were how, listening together and kind of thinking of that community engagement in terms of that metadata creation was a way of actually capturing emotion as well, to kind of capture a reaction. So the writing together, writing metadata as community memory, as community members was quite powerful as well. And I'm definitely all about metadata standards. Being with DRI, and we wrote various metadata handbooks. So, but I also wanted people to challenge metadata standards within that framework as well, because we were thinking about controlled vocabularies and perhaps how restrictive they might be in terms of various communities and how they identify. So currently, the Queer in Brighton archive, in inverted commas, is sitting in my office. So whether or not it is safe at the moment, it was in a basement of a pub up until 2 months ago. But for me anyway, and I use this as a kind of with different presentations that I've done around this, was that the oral histories are sitting on a hard drive. That's the top object there, and as people in the room know, that is the most fragile object in that collection. So this is the kind of the objects that we are working through at the moment, and we will be having another exhibition, or we will have an exhibition in February, that will use the oral histories in a different way. So not just a digital archive, thinking about reuse in a different way. So it will be an installation in the library, there will be an interactive object where people will get snippets of that archive. And then just kind of creating momentum in terms of community engagement, institutional engagement around community archives and their problem with digital preservation.